Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. The name Aware is made up of the initials of our full name, Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carlos DeBrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, October 17th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world, and the racism against people in foreign countries encouraged sotto voce by our government. At this moment, the U.S. is making war and killing people in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, and also the Philippines. Thousands of U.S. troops are fighting in these wars, although most Americans are not aware of it. In addition, the 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. Why is our government terrorizing the world to the point that international polls show the U.S. is by far the most feared country in the world? Not Russia, China, North Korea, or Iran? The answer is simple and horrible. The U.S. is killing people to protect the accelerating profits of the 1%, the American economic elite. I want to talk a little tonight about how that's come about, and I will refer to this map over my right shoulder that is a little unusual, but I think if you look at it closely, you can see that it resembles other world maps that you've seen. It's called a Fuller projection, named for Buckminster Fuller, who developed it. I knew Buckminster Fuller slightly, and many years ago worked for him on a geodesic dome that still exists in Montreal. What Fuller has done with this map is to project the world, the map of the world, onto a geodesic dome and then unfold it, like peeling the sections of an orange in a way that allows you to have an arrangement of the land masses of the world with North America here rather than in the middle, and Asia and Europe here. And that relationship shows a little more accurately the size of the various continents and also the relationship to one another if you unfold the orange peel of the globe. The center of attention for American foreign policy for more than a century has been Eurasia, the landmass here, Europe and Asia. Not Europe by itself or the Western Hemisphere. Since at least the open door policy of 1899, the U.S. government has been determined to prevent the economic integration of the combined continental landmass of Europe and Asia under any power, Eastern or Western, for fear that it would hinder the economic exploitation of Eurasia by the American 1%. That's what the unpleasantness with the Japanese in the 1940s was about, the Second World War in the Pacific. We wanted to conquer their greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, which threatened to exclude American business, American capitalism from the Asian world. That's why the U.S. in the Second World War left Russia to confront Hitler alone. We were much more interested in the Pacific. Russia lost perhaps 27 million people in World War II. The U.S. in all theaters lost less than 500,000. The bedrock of U.S. foreign policy today remains the containment of Eurasia and the retardation of its economic development. The American task is more difficult today at any time since World War II, owing to an effective alliance between Russia and China, and their effective alliance with other states, notably Iran and Syria. That's what the 1,000 military bases the U.S. has around Eurasia are meant to contain. If you look at a map of Europe bases, you see that they ring the largest landmass of the world that contains Russia and China. Russia has 15 bases outside of its home territory. China has 1. The U.S. has 1,000. When World War II ended in 1945, the U.S. was the only undamaged major country on any side. The situation was described in 1948 in a secret State Department memorandum by the liberal diplomat George Kennan. Quote, this is 1948, not revealed, not published for 25 years after that because it was a secret document. We have about 50% of the world's wealth, we being the United States, but only 6.3% of its population. This disparity is particularly great as between ourselves and the peoples of Asia. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity without positive detriment to our national security. To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere on our immediate national objectives. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction. Close quote. That's George Kennan writing a secret State Department document in 1948 about America's post-war plans. Since World War II ended in 1945, U.S. presidents have killed more than 20 million people to maintain the disparity, and they continue to do so today. President Obama was the first U.S. president in history to be at war throughout 2 presidential terms. In the campaign, President Trump criticized the 8 wars Obama was conducting, his war provocations against Russia and China, and his drone assassinations that killed 5,000 people and were accurately called the greatest terrorist program in modern times. But once in office, Trump has adopted those very policies himself. Our anti-war group, AWARE, was formed 16 years ago after the attacks on New York and Washington on 9/11/2001 and before the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, which began America's longest war. Barack Obama was the first U.S. president in history to have been at war all the way through 2 presidential terms. The founders of AWARE saw that the U.S. government would use the crimes of 9/11 as an excuse to carry on its wars in the Mideast. The U.S. government says it's fighting terrorism, but it is in fact killing people in order to control Mideast oil, what the U.S. State Department called in 1945 the world's greatest material prize. The U.S. doesn't need Mideast oil. What we use here comes principally from the U.S., Canada, Venezuela, and Nigeria. But control of oil from Southwest Asia and North Africa gives the U.S. a chokehold over Eurasian economic rivals from Germany to China. As mentioned, since World War II, U.S. presidents have killed between 20 and 30 million people for the profits of the American economic elite. Ordinary Americans have paid for these vicious wars, but they haven't profited from them. Most Americans are not aware of how much of the world is appalled at what the U.S. government has done in our lifetimes. It's a triumph of the American system of propaganda and intellectual control, the most effective in history, that Americans are able to ignore it. Those of us in AWARE, like other anti-war groups in the United States and around the world, today call upon President Trump to, 1, establish a foreign policy based on diplomacy, international law, human rights, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations, notably Russia, China, Iran, and Syria. 2, end the wars in the Mideast and elsewhere, stop the drone attacks, and end the war provocations against Russia and China. 3, cut military spending by at least 50% and close the more than 800, as I said a moment ago, it's probably closer to 1,000, U.S. military bases ringing Eurasia. bring all U.S. troops and weapons home, and withdraw U.S. special forces who've been sent into three-quarters of the world's countries. 4. Stop U.S. support of human rights abusers, notably Israel and Saudi Arabia. And 5. Lead on global nuclear disarmament. Revoke the Obama administration's trillion-dollar plan to update U.S. nuclear weapons and make them more usable. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you don't get a very clear account of it in the American media, which are dominated by the pro-war U.S. political establishment. We'll try to give a better account tonight by looking at the U.S. government's goals over the long term. I have here an article by Alfred McCoy, professor of history at the University of Wisconsin, entitled The Geopolitics of American Global Decline, Washington versus China in the 21st Century. McCoy is an historian who made his reputation by talking about the politics of heroin in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. And now, as an emeritus historian, has done quite a remarkable job, I think, with the several recent articles about American foreign policy and America in relative decline to the other countries of the world, notably the Eurasian countries. For even the greatest of empires, geography is often destiny. You wouldn't know it in Washington, though. America's political, national security, and foreign policy elites continued to ignore the basics of geopolitics that have shaped the fate of world empires for the past 500 years. Consequently, they have missed the significance of the rapid global changes in Eurasia that are in the process of undermining the grand strategy for world domination that Washington has pursued for these last 7 decades. A glance at what passes for insider wisdom in Washington these days reveals a worldview of stunning insularity. Take Harvard political scientist Joseph Nye, Jr., known for his concept of soft power, as an example. Offering a simple list of ways in which he believes U.S. military, economic, and cultural power remain singular and superior, he recently argued that there was no force, internal or global, capable of eclipsing America's future as the world's premier power. For those pointing to Beijing's surging economy, China's surging economy, and proclaiming this the Chinese century, Nye offered up a list of negatives. China's per capita income will take decades to catch up, if ever, with America's. It has myopically focused its policies primarily on its region, and it has not developed any significant capabilities for global force projection. That's the way they talk in Washington. Above all, Nye claimed, China suffers geopolitical disadvantages in the internal Asian balance of power compared to America. Or put it this way, and in this Nye is typical of a whole world of Washington thinking, with more allies, ships, fighters, missiles, money, patents, and blockbuster movies than any other power, Washington wins, hands down. If Professor Nye paints power by the numbers, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger's latest tome, modestly entitled World Order, and hailed in reviews as nothing less than a revelation, adopts a Nietzschean perspective. You remember Nietzsche, the prophet of the Superman and of the will to power. This is the idea is suggested behind Kissinger's view. The Age's Kissinger portrays global politics as plastic and so highly susceptible to shaping by great leaders with a will to power. By this measure, in the tradition of master European diplomat Charles de Talleyrand and Prince Metternich, President Theodore Roosevelt was a bold visionary who launched an American role in managing the Asia-Pacific equilibrium. That's Kissinger's view, and he's right to go back at least to Roosevelt, the first Roosevelt's presidency, to understand the American preoccupation, the American ruling class of preoccupation with Eurasia. On the other hand, Woodrow Wilson's idealistic dream of national self-determination rendered him geopolitically inept. A strange reading of Wilson, perhaps, but that was the way in which the argument was set out. And Franklin Roosevelt was blind to Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin's steely global strategy. This is Kissinger's view, of course. Harry Truman, in contrast, overcame national ambivalence to commit America to the shaping of a new international order, a policy wisely followed by the next 12 presidents. Again, this should be read with some irony as a summary of Kissinger's view. Among the most courageous of those presidents, Kissinger insists, was that leader of courage, dignity, and conviction, George W. Bush, whose resolute bid for the transformation of Iraq from among the Middle East's most repressive states to a multi-party democracy would have succeeded had it not been for the ruthless subversion of his work by Syria and Iran. In such a view, geopolitics has no place. Only the bold vision of statesmen and kings really matters. That's the level of fantasy that the premier spokesperson for American foreign policy, the ancient Henry Kissinger, offers us. And perhaps that's a comforting perspective in Washington at a moment when America's hegemony is visibly crumbling amid a tectonic shift in global power. With Washington's anointed seers strikingly obtuse on the subject of geopolitical power, perhaps it's time to get back to basics. That means returning to the foundational text of modern geopolitics, which remains an indispensable guide, even though it was published in an obscure British geography journal well over a century ago. This is an article by Alfred McCoy, the noted historian, about the American geopolitical situation and the fantasies about it that occupy our discussion of the matter. He insists that the best account is based on a little-known discussion from more than a century ago. On a cold London evening in January 1904, Sir Halford Mackinder, the director of the London School of Economics, entranced an audience at the Royal Geographical Society on Savile Row with a paper boldly entitled The Geographical Pivot of History. This presentation evinced, said the Society's president, a brilliancy of description we have seldom had equaled in this room. Mackinder argued that the future of global power, remember he's talking in 1904 now, lay not, as most British then imagined, in controlling the global sea lanes, sea power, but in controlling a vast land mass he called Eurasia. By turning the globe away from America, here, to place Central Asia at the planet's epicenter, landmass here, and then tilting the Earth's axis northward just a bit beyond the standard Mercator equatorial projection, Mackinder redrew and thus reconceptualized the world map. His new map showed Asia, Africa, and Europe not as three separate continents, but as a unitary landmass, a veritable world island. So, Asia, Africa, and Europe in the middle as the world island. Its broad, deep heartland, 4,000 miles from the Persian Gulf to the Siberian Sea, the heartland, was so enormous that it could only be controlled from its rimlands in Eastern Europe, here, and or what he called its maritime marginal in the surrounding seas. So this is the landmass that he suggested was the geographical pivot of history, controllable only, as it were, by its edges. The discovery of the Cape Road to the Indies in the 16th century, where Europe got here, Mackinder wrote, endowed Christendom with the widest possible mobility of power, wrapping her influence around the Eurasian land power, which had hitherto threatened her very existence. This greater mobility, he later explained, gave Europe's seamen superiority for some 4 centuries over the landsmen of Africa and Asia. Yet the heartland of this vast landmass, a pivot area stretching from the Persian Gulf to China's Yangtze River, there, remained nothing less than the Archimedean fulcrum for future world power. Who rules the heartland controls the world island. The world island being a large area, went Mackinder's later summary of the situation. Who rules the world island commands the world. Beyond the vast mass of that world island, which made up nearly 60% of the Earth's land area, lay a less consequential hemisphere covered with broad oceans and a few outlying smaller islands. He meant, of course, Australia and the Americas. Those are the outlying islands. For an earlier generation, the opening of the Suez Canal and the advent of steam shipping had increased the mobility of sea power relative to land power. But future railways could work the greater wonder in the steppe, Mackinder claimed, undercutting the cost of sea transport and shifting the locus of geopolitical power inland. In the fullness of time, the pivot state of Russia might, in alliance with another power like Germany, expand over the marginal lands of Eurasia, allowing use of vast continental resources for fleet building, and the empire of the world would be in sight. Controlling this meant controlling the world, said Mackinder. Now, it's important to realize Mackinder's writing, as I say, over a century ago, and we suddenly realize that it was only in the 19th century that the invention of the railroad meant that land travel was actually faster than sea travel. If you wanted to get someplace in a hurry in the world before the 19th century, you went by sea. It was only with the advent of the railroad that this situation was changed, and it is changed now, and that even the movement of goods across Eurasia today is faster by land than by sea. That is the modern world. The next 2 hours at the lecture in 1904, as he read through a thick text with the convoluted syntax and classical references expected of a former Oxford Don, Mackinder's audience knew that they were privy to something extraordinary. Several stayed after to offer extended commentaries. For instance, the renowned military analyst Spencer Wilkinson, the first to hold a chair in military history at Oxford, pronounced himself unconvinced about the modern expansion of Russia, insisting that British and Japanese naval power would continue the historic function of holding the balance between the divided forces on the continental area. Pressed by his learned listeners to consider other facts or factors, including air as a means of locomotion. Remember, this is 1904, so it took some imagination to think about air travel as a new form of movement across the face of the earth. Mackinder responded, "My aim is not to predict a great future for this or that country, but to make a geographical formula into which you could fit any political balance." Instead of specific events, Mackinder was reaching for a general theory about the causal connection between geography and global power. The future of the world, he insisted, depends on the maintenance of a balance of power between sea powers such as Britain or Japan operating from the maritime marginal and the expansive internal forces within the Eurasian heartland they were intent on containing. Now, this is, as I say, particularly important because we come to realize now that American foreign policy continues to this day to be an attempt to contain Eurasia, that's Russia and China now, contain Eurasia and retard their economic development for fear that an economically integrated Eurasia would be an economic rival to the profits of the American 1%. This has been the guide of American foreign policy since the end of the 19th century. Not only did Mackinder give voice to a worldview that would influence Britain's foreign policy for several decades, but he had in that moment created the modern science of geopolitics, the study of how geography can, under certain circumstances, shape the destiny of whole peoples, nations, and empires. That night in London was, of course, more than a long time ago. It was another age. England was still mourning the death of Queen Victoria. Teddy Roosevelt was president. Henry Ford had just opened a small auto plant in Detroit to make his Model A, an automobile with a top speed of 28 miles per hour. Only a month earlier, the Wright brothers' Flyer had taken to the air for the first time, 120 feet of air to be exact. Yet for the next 110 years, Sir Halford Mackinder's words would offer a prism of exceptional precision when it came to understanding the often obscure geopolitics driving the world's major conflicts. 2 world wars, a Cold War, America's Asian wars, Korea and Vietnam, 2 Persian Gulf Wars, and even the endless pacification of Afghanistan. The question today is, how can Sir Halford help us understand not only centuries past, but the half-century still to come, if there is one? At this point, Alfred McCoy, whose article on the geography of history we are considering, turns his attention to Britannia ruling the waves. In the age of sea power that lasted just over 400 years, from 1602 to the Washington Disarmament Conference of 1922, the great powers competed to control the Eurasian world via the surrounding sea lanes that stretched for 15,000 miles from London to Tokyo. London to Tokyo. A matter of containment of Eurasia. The instrument of power was, of course, the ship. First men of war, then battleships, submarines, and aircraft carriers. While land armies slogged through the mud of Manchuria or France, First and Second World War, in battles with mind-numbing casualties, imperial navies skimmed over the seas, maneuvering for the control of whole coasts and continents. At the peak of its imperial power, circa 1900, Great Britain ruled the waves with a fleet of 300 capital ships and 30 naval bastions, bases that ringed the world island from the North Atlantic at Scapa Flow, through the Mediterranean at Malta and Suez, to Bombay, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Just as the Roman Empire enclosed the Mediterranean, making it Mare Nostrum, Latin for RC, British power would make the Indian Ocean its own closed sea, securing its flanks with army forces on India's northwest frontier and barring both Persians and Ottomans from building naval bases on the Persian Gulf. That is, the sea power of Britain controlled this area and therefore controlled the peoples of this area. By that maneuver, Britain also secured control over Arabia and Mesopotamia. Strategic terrain that Mackinder had termed the passage land from Europe to the Indies and the gateway to the world island's heartland. From this geographical perspective, the 19th century was at heart a strategic rivalry, often called the Great Game, between Russia, in command of nearly the whole of the heartland, knocking at the landward gates of the Indies, and Britain, that's Mackinder's phrase, and Britain advancing inland from the sea gates of India to meet the menace from the northwest. This is the great game of the 19th century. Britain controlling this land, and Russia controlling the heartland. In other words, Mackinder concluded the final geographical realities of the modern age were sea power versus land power. Intense rivalries, first between England and France, then England and Germany, helped drive a relentless European naval arms race that raised the price of sea power to unsustainable levels. In 1805, Admiral Nelson's flagship, the HMS Victory in the Napoleonic Wars, with its oaken hull weighing just 3,500 tons, sailed into the Battle of Trafalgar against Napoleon's navy at 9 knots, its 100 smoothbore cannon firing 42-pound balls at a range of no more than 400 yards. That was naval warfare in the early 19th century. In 1906, just a century later, Britain launched the world's first modern battleship, the HMS Dreadnought. Its foot-thick steel hull weighing 20,000 tons, as opposed to the 3,500 tons of Nelson's ship, its steam turbines allowing speeds of 21 knots, opposed to 9 knots for Nelson, and its mechanized 12-inch guns rapid-firing 850-pound shells up to 12 miles, not to 400 yards of Nelson's ship. The cost for this Leviathan was 1.8 million pounds, equivalent to nearly $300 million today. Within a decade, half a dozen powers had emptied their treasuries to build whole fleets of these lethal, lavishly expensive battleships. That's in the beginning of the 20th century and the run-up to the First World War. Thanks to a combination of technological superiority, global reach, and naval alliances with the U.S. and Japan, a Pax Britannica would last a full century, the British peace after the defeat of Napoleon, 1815 to 1914. In the end, however, this global system was marked by an accelerating naval arms race, volatile great power diplomacy, and a bitter competition for overseas empire that imploded into the mindless slaughter of World War I, leaving 16 million dead by 1918. You're listening to and watching Aware on the Air, our attempt to discuss American wars and the opposition to them. And today we're considering a historical perspective offered by Professor Alfred McCoy of the University of Wisconsin on modern strategic thinkers, which he traces back to an important observation at the beginning of the 20th century by Sir Howland Mackinder, a British scholar and academic. In the section called Mackinder's Century, McCoy continues, as the eminent imperial historian Paul Kennedy once observed, the rest of the 20th century bore witness to Mackinder's thesis, with 2 world wars fought over his rimlands running from Eastern Europe through the Middle East to East Asia, the area around the world island. Indeed, World War I was, as Mackinder himself later observed, a straight duel between land power and sea power. At war's end in 1918, the sea powers, Britain, America, and Japan, sent naval expeditions to Archangel, the Black Sea, and Siberia to contain Russia's revolution inside the heartland. Most Americans don't realize that the U.S. invaded Russia after the Russian Revolution in order to put the revolution down. Mackinder puts this in McCoy puts this in context by pointing out that the fight between land powers and sea powers was carried over into the revolution or the battle against the revolution in Russia that the U.S., Britain, and Japan continued. Reflecting Mackinder's influence on geopolitical thinking in Germany, Adolf Hitler would risk his Reich in a misbegotten effort to capture the Russian heartland as Lebensraum, or living space, for his master race. When Hitler invades Russia in the summer of 1941, the battle is joined that will defeat Germany. Americans think that Hitler's Germany was defeated in Normandy by Private Ryan. That's not true. The war in Russia, or the Second World War rather, was won and lost in Russia, and it cost the Russians 27 million people. Sir Halford's work, Mackinder, helped shape the ideas of German geographer Karl Haushofer, founder of the journal Zeitschrift für Geopolitik, proponent of the concept of Lebensraum, and an advisor to Adolf Hitler and his deputy Führer Rudolf Hess. In 1942, the Führer dispatched 1 million men, 10,000 artillery pieces, and 500 tanks to breach the Volga River at Stalingrad. In the end, his forces suffered 850,000 wounded, killed, and captured in a vain attempt to break through the East European rimland into the world island's pivotal region. A century after Mackinder's seminal treatise, another British scholar, imperial historian John Darwin, argued in his magisterial survey After Tamerlane that the United States had achieved its colossal empire, on an unprecedented scale in the wake of World War II by becoming the first power in history to control the strategic axial points at both ends of Eurasia. Translation, he's saying that the U.S. domination of world politics in 1945, as the only undamaged country to emerge from the Second World War, came from its control of both sides, so to speak, of the world island, its control of Europe on one side, and its control of the Asia-Pacific on the other side. With fears of Chinese and Russian expansion serving as the catalyst for collaboration, the U.S. won imperial bastions in both Western Europe and Japan. With these axial point, the point on which an axis depends or moves, so to speak, with these axial points, as anchor, Washington then built an arc of military bases that followed Britain's maritime template and were visibly meant to encircle the world island. I mentioned before the 1,000 U.S. bases that the U.S. has in the world. If we could put them up here in lights, what you would see would be a great circle of American bases running off into the distance, but concentrated on controlling Eurasia, the conjunction of Europe and China. Alfred McCoy, whose article we're considering today, continues with a section on America's axial geopolitics, references to these 2 points. Having seized the axial ends of the world island from Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in 1945, the defeat of Germany and Japan gave the U.S. the control of both sides of the world island. For the next 70 years, the United States relied on ever-thickening layers of military power to contain Russia and China inside that Eurasian heartland. Stripped of its ideological foliage, Washington's grand strategy of Cold War era anti-communist containment was little more than a process of imperial succession. A hollowed-out Britain was replaced astride the maritime marginal, but the strategic realities remain essentially the same. The sea control that Britain had before the Second World War was succeeded by the control that the U.S. exercised after the war. Indeed, in 1943, 2 years before World War II ended, an aging Mackinder published his last article, The Round World and the Winning of the Peace, in the influential U.S. journal Foreign Affairs. Foreign Affairs still exists. It's the major conservative journal of foreign policy among academics in the United States. In it, he reminded Americans aspiring to a grand strategy for an unprecedented version of planetary hegemony that even their dream of global air power would not change geopolitical basics. This is what Mackinder said during the Second World War and envisioning its end. If the Soviet Union emerges from this war as conqueror of Germany, Mackinder warned, she must rank as the greatest land power on the globe, controlling the greatest natural fortress on Earth, that is, the Russian territory. And that, of course, is, in a sense, what happened. Russia defeated Germany and emerged as the greatest land power on the globe. That prompted the United States to initiate the Cold War. When it came to the establishment of a new post-war Pax Americana, American peace, first and foundational for the containment of Soviet land power would be the U.S. Navy. Its fleets would come to surround the Eurasian continent, supplementing and then supplanting the British Navy. The Sixth Fleet was based at Naples in 1946 for control of the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. The U.S. Seventh Fleet at Subic Bay in the Philippines in 1947 for the Western Pacific, and the Fifth Fleet at Bahrain in the Persian Gulf since 1995. Next, American diplomats added layers of encircling military alliances. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949, the Middle East Treaty Organization in 1955, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization in 1954, and the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty in 1951. By 1955, the U.S. also had a global network of 450 military bases in 36 countries aimed in large part at containing the Sino-Soviet, the Chinese-Russian, bloc behind an Iron Curtain that coincided to a surprising degree with Mackinder's rimlands around the Eurasian landmass. And that was by the 1950s, the U.S. with 450 bases did this, and it's doubled that number since then. By the Cold War's end in 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the encirclement of Communist China and Russia required 700 overseas bases, an air force of 1,800 jet fighters, a vast nuclear arsenal, this is all the U.S., of course, more than 1,000 ballistic missiles, and a navy of 600 ships, including 15 nuclear carrier battle groups, all linked by the world's only global system of communication satellites. That's what the U.S. did in the Cold War. As the fulcrum for Washington's strategic perimeter around the world island, the Persian Gulf region has for nearly 40 years been the site of constant American intervention, overt and covert. The 1979 revolution in Iran meant the loss of a keystone country in the arch of U.S. power. It leads us back to President Trump's comments about Iran this week. The 79 revolution in Iran was a setback for the U.S. power circle around the Gulf and left Washington struggling to rebuild its presence in the region. That's why you've heard so much about the Middle East in the last generation. To that end, the U.S. would simultaneously back Saddam Hussein's Iraq and its war against revolutionary Iran, and arm the most extreme of the Afghan Mujahideen, the Islamic fighters, the Islamic terrorists, against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. You have to realize modern jihadism, radical Islamic fighters, were invented by the United States, by the very same Zbigniew Brzezinski I mentioned a moment ago, in order, as Brzezinski said, to give the Soviets a Vietnam of their own in Afghanistan. And that was in the Carter administration. That's been the cornerstone of American policy in the Middle East ever since, support radical Islam as a threat to the Russians. The Russians have responded in Syria to the overall U.S. policy, and that means that we read the headlines about Syria still to this day. It was in this context that Zbigniew Brzezinski, National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter, unleashed his strategy for the defeat of the Soviet Union with a sheer geopolitical agility still little understood even today. In 1979, Brzezinski, a déclassé Polish aristocrat, uniquely attuned to his native continent's geopolitical realities, persuaded Carter to launch Operation Cyclone, with a CIA operation, with massive funding that reached $500 million annually by the late 1980s. Its goal, to mobilize Muslim militants to attack the Soviet Union's soft Central Asian underbelly and drive a wedge of radical Islam deep into the Soviet heartland. It was to simultaneously inflict a demoralizing defeat on the Red Army in Afghanistan and cut Eastern Europe's rimland free from Moscow's orbit. Quote, "We didn't push the Russians to intervene in Afghanistan," Brzezinski said in 1998, explaining his geopolitical masterstroke in this Cold War edition of The Great Game, "but we knowingly increased the probability that they would. That secret operation was an excellent idea," said Brzezinski. "Its effect was to draw the Russians into the Afghan trap." We might ask who's in the Afghan trap today, but that would be getting ahead of the story. Asked about this operation's legacy when it came to creating a militant Islam hostile to the U.S., had certain effects in 9/11, 2001, Brzezinski, who studied and frequently cited Mackinder, was coolly unapologetic. Quote, "What is most important to the history of the world?" he asked. "The Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire? Some stirred up Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War?" Close quote. Yet even America, that's Brzezinski explaining why, Islamic fundamentalist terrorists in the Middle East are really kind of a good idea and something that the U.S. has supported since he invented them, so to speak, in the 1970s. Yet even America's stunning victory in the Cold War, with the implosion of the Soviet Union, would not transform the geopolitical fundamentals of the world island. As a result, after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, Washington's first foreign foray in the new era would involve an attempt to reestablish his dominant position in the Persian Gulf, using Saddam Hussein's occupation of Kuwait as a pretext. In 2003, when the U.S. invaded Iraq, Imperial historian Paul Kennedy returned to Mackinder's century-old treatise to explain this seemingly inexplicable misadventure. Quote, "Right now, with hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops in the Eurasian rimlands," the area, around Russia and China, Kennedy wrote, "it looks as if Washington is taking seriously Mackinder's injunction to ensure control of the geographical pivot of history, that is, Eurasia. If we interpret these remarks expansively, the sudden proliferation of U.S. bases across Afghanistan and Iraq should be seen as yet another imperial bid for a pivotal position at the edge of the Eurasian heartland, akin to those old British colonial forts along India's northwest frontier." In the ensuing years, Washington attempted to replace some of its ineffective boots on the ground with drones in the air, notably in the Obama administration. By 2011, the Air Force and the CIA had ringed the Eurasian landmass with 60 bases for its armada of drones. By then, its workhorse Reaper, armed with Hellfire missiles and GBU-30 bombs, had a range of 1,200 miles, which meant that from those bases it could strike targets almost anywhere in Africa and Asia. If George Bush II's contribution was the great crime of the invasion of Iraq, then Obama's contribution was the great crime of the drone assassination that killed thousands of people from the air. Significantly, drone bases now dot the maritime margins around the world island. From Sigonella, Sicily, to Incirlik, Turkey, Djibouti on the Red Sea, Qatar and Abu Dhabi on the Persian Gulf, the Seychelles Islands in the Indian Ocean, Jalalabad, Kandahar, and Sindan in Afghanistan, and in the Pacific, Zamboanga in the Philippines, and Andersen Air Base on the island of Guam, among other places. These are drone installations that repeat the encirclement of Eurasia. To patrol the sweeping periphery, the Pentagon is spending $10 billion to build an armada of 99 Global Hawk drones equipped with high-resolution cameras capable of surveying all terrain within a 100-mile radius, electronic sensors that can sweep up communications, and efficient engines capable of 35 hours of continuous flight and a range of 9,000 miles. This is Alfred McCoy talking about the situation that has eventuated from the war-making of recent administrations, notably the Bush and Obama administrations. He turns his attention now to China strategy. Washington's moves, in other words, represent something old, even if on a previously unimaginable scale. But the rise of China as the world's largest economy, inconceivable a century ago, represents something new and so threatens to overturn the maritime politics that have shaped world power for the past 400 years. Instead of focusing purely on building a blue water navy like the British or a global aerospace armada akin to America's, China is reaching deep within the world island in an attempt to thoroughly reshape the geopolitical fundamentals of global power. It's using a subtle strategy that has so far eluded Washington's power elites. After decades of quiet preparation, Beijing has recently begun revealing its grand strategy for global power move by careful move. Its two-step plan is designed to build a transcontinental infrastructure for the economic integration of the world island from within, while mobilizing military forces to surgically strike through Washington's encircling containment. The initial step has involved a breathtaking project to put in place infrastructure for the continent's economic integration. By laying down an elaborate and enormously expensive network of high-speed, high-volume railroads, as well as oil and natural gas pipelines across the vast breadth of Eurasia, China may realize Mackinder's vision in a new way. For the first time in history, the rapid transcontinental movement of critical cargo, oil, minerals, and manufactured goods, will be possible on a massive scale, thereby potentially unifying that vast landmass into a single economic zone stretching 6,500 miles from Shanghai to Madrid. In this way, the leadership in Beijing hopes to shift the locus of geopolitical power away from the maritime periphery and deep into the continent's heartland. Transcontinental railways are now transmuting the conditions of land power, wrote Mackinder back in 1904, as the precarious single track of the Trans-Siberian Railway, the world's longest, reached across the continent for 5,700 miles from Moscow to Vladivostok. But the century will not be old before all Asia is covered with railroads, Mackinder added in 1904. The spaces within the Russian Empire and Mongolia are so vast and their potentialities in fuel and metals so incalculably great that a vast economic world, more or less apart, will there develop inaccessible to oceanic commerce. Mackinder was a bit premature in his prediction. The Russian Revolution of 1917, the Chinese Revolution of 1949, and the subsequent 40 years of the American Cold War slowed any real development for decades. In this way, the Eurasian heartland was denied economic growth and integration, thanks in part to artificial ideological barriers, the Iron Curtain and then the Sino-Soviet split, that stalled any infrastructure construction across the vast Eurasian landmass. That's no longer true. Only a few years after the Cold War ended, former National Security Advisor Brzezinski, by then a contrarian sharply critical of the global views of both Republican and Democratic policy elites, began raising warning flags about Washington's inept style of geopolitics. Ever since the continent started interacting politically some 500 years ago, he wrote in 1998, essentially paraphrasing Mackinder, Eurasia has been the center of world power. A power that dominates Eurasia would control two of the world's three most advanced and economically productive regions, rendering the Western Hemisphere and Oceania geopolitically peripheral to the world's central continent. While such geopolitical logic has eluded Washington, it's been well understood in Beijing. Indeed, in the last decade, China has launched the world's largest burst of infrastructure investment, already $1 trillion and counting, since Washington started the U.S. interstate highway system back in the 1950s. The numbers for the rails and pipelines it's been building are mind-numbing. Between 2007 and 2014, China crisscrossed its countryside with 9,000 miles of new high-speed rail, more than the rest of the world combined. The system now carries 2.5 million passengers daily at top speeds of 240 miles per hour. By the time the system is complete in 2030, it will have added up to 16,000 miles of high-speed track at a cost of $300 billion, linking all of China's major cities. Simultaneously, China's leadership began collaborating with surrounding states on a massive project to integrate the country's national rail network into a transcontinental grid. Starting in 2008, the Germans and Russians joined with the Chinese in launching the Eurasian Land Bridge. Two east-west routes, the old Trans-Siberian in the north and a new southern route along the ancient Silk Road through Kazakhstan, are meant to bind all of Eurasia together. On the quicker southern route, containers of high-value manufactured goods, computers, and auto parts started traveling 6,700 miles from Leipzig, Germany, to Chongqing, China, in just 20 days, about half the 35 days such goods now take by ship. This is the Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese plan that we'll hear something more about this week in the Chinese Communist Party's convention, which opens tomorrow in Beijing. We've been reading tonight on Aware on the Air an article by Alfred McCoy, professor of history at Wisconsin, about the geopolitical nature of the American confrontation with Russia and China, its attempt to maintain control of Eurasia, which is the central point of American foreign policy for more than a century. You've been listening to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 42nd week of 2017. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is not made up of just the attacks by ISIS and its sympathizers around the world, but by U.S. worldwide war-making. My thanks tonight to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson for research. See No's notes on the blog newsfromneptune.com. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young. Thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube, and see the Facebook page for Aware for the articles referred to tonight. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.